Good morning. Thank you everyone for coming to this talk. We have our special guest today from the Aga Khan University's Institute of Islamic Civilization.
Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilization.
Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilization, ISMC. So Jeff, Professor Jeff Tan works on water governance issues, and he was recently in Gilgit to conduct a workshop. And so it's not only like an academic concern, it's also focused on policymakers, I understand, and communities. So we are very happy that we got lucky that on the way back, Jeff agreed to come and speak to you guys. So we did have a plan for a PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately, due to technical reasons, we're just going to keep it an informal conversation.
It's human error, really.
But I'm really excited, and I was mentioning to Jeff that a lot of students gathered here are interested in water. Some of you have taken courses on water politics. Some are currently enrolled in this. And a wide range of focus. People have worked on floods, disasters, and infrastructure, and a lot of different issues around water. So we're really hoping that it's going to be an interesting conversation, that you're going to give Jeff a little bit of a hard time with your questions. And so without taking more time, I'll give it to Jeff, and we're going to start. The topic that was shared is called Decentralization, Participation and Community Water Management, Neoliberalism and State Fragmentation. And if I could just quickly read the abstract about...
Is this shared with everyone?
It is shared. Yes. Community-based water management remains the leading model for implementing and sustaining rural water supply services in low and middle income countries, including Pakistan, and has recently been expanded to urban centers. However, sustainable community-based water management requires policy and institutional support in the wider context of a fragmented state with limited capacity. So Jeff's talk will examine the underlying limitations of CBWM and reasons for its ongoing promotion despite evidence that this has not been sustainable. It looks at the successful delivery of a large-scale CBWM program in GB and whether this is sustainable and scalable to other parts of Pakistan as well. Thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, everyone. So I presented some nice slides. Can you actually see that?
Yeah, maybe we
really?
can do it like this.
Wow. You have much better eyes than me. Apologies, I forgot a small device which allows me to plug this and connect to an HDMI for the PowerPoint. So, Asan, thank you for the very generous introduction. This really is part of, this particular trip is part of ISMC's governance program, of which my colleague, Professor Gianluca Parolin, is here with me. The governance program is actually a separately funded are you happy for me to talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a separately funded program within ISMC, which was really at the behest of His Highness the Aga Khan, who prioritizes governance as one of the key development challenges in the world today. And the governance program is led by Professor Parolin, and it deals with a bunch of a governance-related issue, and I was asked if I wanted to do anything on governance. And we had just finished this 2-year British Academy-funded project in Gilgit-Baltistan, looking at the Water and Sanitation Extension Program. Anyone from GB? Yeah? So those from GB would know of this program. Its acronym is WASAP. It's implemented by one of the Aga Khan Development Network agencies, the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. And we were asked, we partnered them and Karakoram International University to look at whether this was a sustainable model and whether it could be scaled up, because it's been rolled out by the government of Gilgit-Baltistan. So hence these three, the workshop that we ran was really to follow up on one aspect of the findings of that 2-year project, which was really about the role of the state, the public sector in supporting communities in managing these water projects. So the idea of community water management is basically you help them build something, so funding comes from externally, and communities contribute a little bit, and then when it's completed, you sign it off, and the communities are responsible. But the problem, of course, is that they soon realized that communities couldn't deal with this without external support, whether technical, institutional, and financial. Okay, and the question I'm asking here is really, we are expecting the state to now step in to provide this sort of support in order to make community management successful. At the same time when the state itself is incapacitated, it lacks the capacity to do a lot of these things. It lacks the financial resources, for one. And it's been fragmented through the process of decentralization, of which community water management is one of the drivers of that decentralization, bringing down services to the smallest unit viable. I had, this is going to be a bit tricky. You're not going to be able to see this, but basically I had these projections of where countries are today in terms of meeting SDG targets for universal access to safely managed drinking water by 2030. And for countries in the world to reach that, we require a quadrupling of effort, basically 4 times more effort and resources to allow countries to reach the 100% target here. This is too small. It's too small, isn't it? Anyone can see this? Yeah? So that's what we're after. That's access to water, and this access to safely managed drinking water. That's what we're interested in, because this access to water doesn't mean it's safe to drink. Yeah, you have water, but you fall sick. So I've said that. The problem with that 75% where we're at right now, okay, as of 2020, is about 75% of countries are on track to reach 100%. The problem with that is that it masks huge variations in terms of between countries. So when we actually look at this chart here, basically, maybe I'll just read it first, because that's very hard for me to see. So basically, lower middle income countries have improved access between 2000 and 2020, except it's been uneven, and there's been a decline of access to pipe water in urban areas. So when we actually look at Pakistan, I've highlighted Pakistan in yellow. Pakistan has actually declined in terms, it's increased slightly across nationally. That's safe water, and that's pipe, and that's Pakistan here. That's Pakistan, sorry, I can't see. Yeah, that's Pakistan national. You can see it's a decline in both access to safe drinking water between 2000 and 2020, and the decline in pipe water connections. And that decline has been driven by a decline in the urban areas. And I'm guessing that a lot of it has to do with population growth as well. So the investment has not been able to keep up with population expansion. So in terms of per capita access to drinking water, it's been very low. So once you take that into account, actually, if you look at where Pakistan is at, once you disaggregate that 75% of countries that are currently providing safe drinking water, Pakistan is actually at 36% as of 2020. And that compares to other low middle income countries of 60%. So amongst low middle income countries, 60% of the populations in these countries have got access to safely managed drinking water, but in Pakistan that figure is 36%. So this gives us the scale of the challenge here. And you can see in some of these headlines here, regularly. The first one is on reports basically of poor water quality. Yeah? So a lot of water in Pakistan is not safe to drink. This one is this is a more recent one by PCRWR, the Pakistan Council for the Research into Water Resources. And this one is by Gilgit-Baltistan's Environmental Protection Agency, which basically the picture is that, 70 to 80% of water in GB. So in Pakistan is bad, and in Gilgit-Baltistan is just as bad. Okay? And a lot of the contamination is due to bacteria, so E. coli, but also heavy metals. So this is not safe drinking water. So this is a serious public health concern. The question then we have is, why the poor coverage? Why only 36% of the population in Pakistan has access to safely managed drinking water? And why such poor quality? So the mainstream, the general response to this has been that this is a quote here. Let me quickly read it to you. This is a quote from a World Bank report. Government as provider fosters unrealistic local expectations through heavily subsidized services, which merely distort the market and impede local and private initiatives. So in essence, failure is blamed on public sector inefficiency. So this is the underlying starting point of this assessment of why Pakistan hasn't been able to deliver clean drinking water. And this is related, public sector inefficiency is related to a very centralized delivery system that's top-down. It is supply-driven, meaning that the supplier, in this case the government, decides what to provide. As a supply-driven approach, it's heavily subsidized and has low incentives for maintenance. The departments responsible don't have the incentive to maintain it, and actually they don't also have the funds either. Okay, I raised the question here about state failure, market failure. So the question here, so the underlying assessment here is basically this is failure of the state. In economics, it's known as state failure. The failure of the state to deliver, in this case, public services. But of course, one of the underlying issues here is that there's also a market failure, meaning there's a failure of the private sector to deliver water, which is why states step in the first place. And market failure is rarely discussed by the World Bank or what I would call neoliberal economists, simply because they are married to the idea, they're wedded to the idea that we need the private sector. Okay? But there's obvious reasons for market failure, because a private provider of water in Pakistan, and especially in a region like Gilgit-Baltistan where there's uncertainty, there's natural hazards, there's high costs, you're not going to be able to make money. The private operator needs to make a return on its investment, either in terms of profit and to pay its shareholders. This is not possible because of the high cost of infrastructure and the ability of households to pay the sort of tariff levels that you need to make a return on your investment. So, and this is not unique to GB or to Pakistan or the world. Where Gianluca and I come from in the UK, water tariffs are highly regulated, simply because it becomes a political hot potato if you allow the tariffs to just go up because the company, the water provider needs to invest in the sewerage system and they want to double your tariffs. That would be political suicide for the government. So anywhere in the world, it is really highly regulated. So I'm hinting here about this anti-state bias right from the start, which I'll come to later. Okay, so this slide is about community management. Policies do not emerge in a vacuum. Okay, any policy emerges within a specific context. And the context in which community management emerged is really the context of the idea of participation. Now, participation, when it first emerged in the development discourse, was really about empowering communities, and it was about social and political mobilization. Okay, so there's a very political angle to that discourse. And it's very much related, I guess, in a political spectrum, it's a very left progressive approach to development. The idea that communities need to be empowered. In the 1990s to 2000s, this idea of participation has been co-opted, you could say hijacked by mainstream development agencies, and it's been depoliticized. Okay, so basically now it basically means it's been depoliticized to focus on the idea of service delivery, that communities should be empowered to deliver their own services and manage it, and we don't deal with the social mobilization and political aspects of that. We remove that because it becomes a problem dealing with governments, etc. So this is in turn part of a wider decentralization agenda globally. Okay, the idea that centralization is not ideal because central government doesn't really know what the smallest unit in terms of the village really needs, because they're not in contact with that. So what we need to do, we need to break it down and devolve decision making. This is consistent. This is very much consistent with. So in my topic, in my title, the subtitle is about neoliberalism. Are people familiar with neoliberalism? I'm assuming everyone's graduate students here, right?
Yeah.
So
some of them are undergrad, but
right. So the idea of neoliberalism really centers on a focus on reducing the role of the state and promoting the private sector. Okay, so the wider context is neoliberalism, where the state's role is reduced, the state is pretty much fragmented. When you break it down to small units, it's downsized. It's very largely hollowed out. A lot of technical capacities in the civil service is lost as a result, and partly because there's also a lot of key technical aspects of government, whether it's in Pakistan or Malaysia for that matter, or the UK, is actually contracted out to private consultants, for example. And it's the same with water. It's a very key issue, and it's got huge governance implications if we have private consultants drafting public water policies. And it's also the issue of defunding. So departments don't have the necessary resources or expertise anymore. So that's a wider context. And of course, the local Pakistan context is the federal model of federalism, and the 18th Amendment, which devolved a lot of things down to the local level. Okay? Water being a key example. So why community management? I'll need just to prompt me on this. So community management really is an extension of decentralization and idea of participation. And it centers on communities, obviously. Essentially, it's about communities taking over the responsibility, authority, control of water services. In particular, having control over strategic design, implementation, management, determining service levels, tariffs, and also operations and maintenance. It doesn't mean necessarily that communities need to be managing operations and maintenance, which often is the case, but it just means that they have the power to decide if they want to do that. And in some better off communities, they may decide that really we don't want to spend our weekends or evenings in a committee meeting like this discussing water. Let's hire a manager, or let's contract out the management aspect. Okay, and we pay them through collection of tariffs. So what we have as a result of community management really deals with those issues, those problems I mentioned earlier about the problems that was perceived of state failure, in terms of top-down centralized services. So instead of centralized water services, what we have is decentralization. Instead of the top-down approach, we now have a bottom-up approach centered on community participation. So you start with communities, and they come together and decide what needs to be done. Instead of a supply-driven approach where government decides we're now going to build a water system in this location, we have what is known as a demand-responsive approach, where actually the communities themselves decide whether they want a service and what sort of water service they would like. This is important theoretically. Instead of heavy distorting subsidies from government to local agencies, what we have is cost recovery, because cost sharing is a key component. Cost recovery through tariffs. Okay, so free water is no longer viable. Yeah. Someone has to pay for water. It's either the taxpayers or the users. So in the case of community water management, it's the users that should be paying. And the problem of low incentives and poor maintenance of water systems. One big problem, of course, with a lot of public systems is governments build them and they work, they're great, and after a couple of years they run down. There's leakages, there's all sorts of issues, and they don't get fixed. So community ownership, the sense of ownership is meant to incentivize communities to actually maintain these systems and keep them running. So it's meant to be a sustainable alternative to public systems. And again, cost sharing is a key aspect of it. So what are key features? It's currently the leading model for implementing and sustaining rural water in low and middle income countries. It's seen as an alternative to state failure, as I mentioned. And sustainability is typically measured. So when we talk about sustainability, what do we mean by it? In the literature, it's very simply defined in terms of the percentage of water systems or water points that are functioning and have been functioning for the past 6 months, are functioning at the point of inspection and have been functioning for the past 6 months as of the point of inspection. Okay, so the central thesis here of community water management is that strong community management leads to sustainable water supply and sanitation systems. And again, this is a quote from the World Bank. So I have a photo here of the typical sort of labor contributions of communities, laying pipes, for example. So what are the key features of community water management? There's 4 key features. It starts with participation as a foundation of it. Then there's the issue of control and ownership, which go hand in hand. And finally, there's the issue of cost sharing. And each of them are important. You're not going to be able to see this, so I'm just going to quickly run through this. So participation essentially allows communities to identify a need and demand for water, and to take ownership by assuming responsibility and control. So participation is really key to a lot of these other key features. Control is really, as I mentioned earlier, it's about decision-making powers, it's about the community truly being in charge. It requires ownership. There's a debate in the literature of whether this ownership should be legal, as in it needs to be on paper, because in most cases it isn't. It's just that the communities feel like they have ownership because they've invested in it and they're managing it, so they have this sense of ownership, and ownership encourages them to take control, and to look after. So because if you own something, you all know the tragedy of the commons, I assume. Yeah, so if you go to a lake and no one owns the lake, it's overfished and it's polluted. So the new institutional economics or the mainstream economics response to that is we need someone to own it. Then there's an incentive to then, if there's an owner, whether it's private or public, the owner then regulates use of the lake by licensing fishing, monitoring outflows into the lake, etc. So the same thing here with water management. As you got ownership, you want to make sure that any leaks are fixed, for example. Cost sharing allows communities to express this is key. By sharing costs, the communities express a demand. They show that they actually want a service. Because we can all say we want something, but that's not the same as demanding something. Yeah? So in economics, the supply and demand works through the price mechanism, and the fact whether people are willing to pay for something. So they show that they're willing to pay. Again, fosters a sense of ownership, and willingness to pay also shows that the willingness to accept responsibility, and it's an indication of management potential of this. So then I really looked at so this was the previous one. I can share some of these with Hassan if you want it. So what are the problems then of community water management? Which is why what are the research that I was looking at involved. So the problem with community management in terms of these features, the first thing is that in terms of functionality, the evidence globally on community managed systems is that there's high levels of non-functionality. In a lot of places, up to 30% of these water points, for example, are not functional. Okay? And this has been blamed on poor operations and maintenance. The fact that these communities haven't been maintaining it. Although, if you remember correctly, community management is meant to encourage communities to actually maintain the water system, to fix the leaks, etc. But this hasn't actually happened. And within the literature, the community water management literature, the explanation for this is because of internal and external constraints. So internal constraints refer to the social context of a community, and specifically the limitations that communities have. So communities may not be able to manage accounts. They may not have the management skills necessary to run a project. Okay, and the external constraints relate to what is known as the lack of an enabling environment. Okay. The enabling environment is essentially, as I mentioned at the start, it's about the sort of institutional and external support given to communities to allow them, to help them manage their water systems. So this includes not just policy that promotes community management, legislation, for example, ownership perhaps, legislation to compel users to pay the tariffs, to empower, to authorize community management committees to collect tariffs, because these are some of the issues they face. People don't want to pay. They don't have any authority, any legal mandate to collect money necessarily. Okay? And of course, as I mentioned, there's also a need for financial support, especially when it comes to major repairs, which pretty much none of these communities can manage. If you have, Jean-Luc and I came from Gilgit-Baltistan, and we had to fly from Skardu, which meant we had to drive from Gilgit to Skardu, and that highway is littered with rock slides and landslides, and these are highly damaging. So the damaged infrastructure, and when you have that sort of damage, communities often can make, a lot of communities can manage the minor repairs, but when it comes to a major thing where a chunk of your pipes have been taken out, they don't have resources and they need support. They need external funding. Okay? The problem, so the state, ironically, having been removed from the provision of drinking water, right, through the process of decentralization and emphasis on community management, are now being brought back in. And the state is now being told, actually, for community water management to work, we need the state to support these communities. The problem, of course, is the state, as I mentioned, is fragmented. It lacks the capacities, it lacks the human resources, it lacks the financial capacity to support these communities. They just don't have the ability to do it. They have neither the technical know-how necessarily, nor for that matter, any incentives, any reasons to help. Because if a community comes to, say, a department, Public Water Works, for example, which the name has changed to Communications and Works, asking for money to repair, for major repair, why would that department want to do it if they don't have the money? They wouldn't. So they'll pass them on to the next department who will have the same reason. So no department will want to take ownership of this because the ownership of these projects is not very clear at all. It is not clear once it's handed over to communities who actually owns it. So the ability of the state to support communities is undermined by decentralization, by fragmentation, and by defunding I mentioned earlier. And a lot of this is a legacy of neoliberal policies that have sought to downsize the state, and also decentralization policies. And in the context of Pakistan, the federal model. And finally, in terms of, so there's three problems here. So I mentioned the problem of functionality and sustainability. I mentioned the lack of an enabling environment. And finally, to me, the key part, and as an economist, I would say this, the key part is that the funding model for community management is highly flawed. It is based on short-term project-based funding as opposed to long-term indefinite financing. So what does it mean? It means that in the case of, say, the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and the WhatsApp scheme, it means that AKA gets a tranche of funds, usually through external, these are all donor-related funds, either through federal government or through GOGB, Government of Gilgit-Baltistan, and they implement it. And these funds may be for X number of projects across X number of districts. So let's say it's a project, the current tranche funded by the German Development Bank, for example, is for 200 projects or 200 sites. They need to maximize the coverage because these locations, these communities have no access to water, let alone clean drinking water. Okay, so you're building pipe networks, which is really important. The problem then is once that money is spent building this infrastructure and it's handed over to communities, there's no more money. And this is why when communities come and say we need money to fix a major repair, AKA doesn't have the money because they actually prefer to prioritize covering as many communities as possible as opposed to covering fewer communities over a longer period of time. So these are all trade-offs in economics. But this is a flaw in the model. Because if the government was providing a service, and if the government was providing a service properly, as it should on paper, it doesn't provide a service to Sector F in Islamabad for 10 years. It's meant to be indefinite. In 10 years' time, the residents of Sector F don't have to go and say, our system is aging and we now need to do some major rehabilitation works and we need to expand it because the population has increased and there's not sufficient capacity to deliver the water. Sustainable water systems don't work that way. So the definition of sustainability really is indefinite water supply, not for the duration of the life of the project, but for the duration of the life of a community that's living there. Okay, so this is the fundamental problem. Okay, so there's short-term financing for what should be a long-term, permanent service. And of course, it is a fragmented delivery system with competing NGOs coming in to deliver different systems. So I then look at those three problems and I look at how this is reflected in the case of WhatsApp, the Water and Sanitation Extension Program in Gilgit-Baltistan. And in many ways, WhatsApp reflects a lot of these issues. And this is not an indictment of WhatsApp because actually, in terms of delivery, WhatsApp is highly, highly successful. Yeah, it's delivered clean drinking water systems to 450 or more villages and town centers. Over 90% of these, 96% of these sites were functioning for our project. We randomly sampled 50 sites, and 96% of these sites, rural and urban, were still functioning. The ones that weren't functioning were the ones that had major damage from natural hazards, mainly related to glacial movements in GB that took out supplies, etc., and the inability of those communities to actually mobilize funds to undertake these major repairs. But aside from that, WhatsApp has been immensely successful. And it actually stands out as what's considered in the literature as an island of success in the broader sea of failure I mentioned earlier amongst the community water management schemes globally. However, none of these projects could undertake major repairs without external support. So as I mentioned, the 96% were able to, and of those, there were some major repairs that were needed, and those 96% that had major repairs, that needed major repairs, and were able to undertake them, did so through additional funding from the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, or they somehow secured funding through government, one of the government agencies. Okay, so external support is key. Let's see if I miss any points. Unfortunately, external support is limited. There was an interesting thing I should share with you as well. One of the interesting things we found was that because we conducted a very large-scale household survey, 3,500 households or so, again randomly selected across GB to represent, the distribution of WhatsApp across the districts, etc. So we were able to run correlations, and one of the correlations we ran was really the correlation between the level of participation that households indicated they had put into that they were, how much they felt they were participating, and different outcomes of the project. And we found that actually very high levels of rural participation compared to urban, which is still quite high. And this is compared to control sites. So we had control sites which were non-WhatsApp government sites, which had much lower levels of participation. But we found that high levels of rural participation in particular did not correlate with the willingness to pay regular tariffs. So somehow people are willing to participate, but when it comes to actual payment, either they were not willing or they're not able to pay. So that's one of the tensions, contradictions within the model that I'll talk to. How much time have I got?
You can take like another 5-10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, let me try to wrap it up. Sorry. Am I making sense so far? To me, I'm super excited when I talk about water, but I realize that everyone else might be fast asleep.
No, I think it's pretty interesting.
Okay. Sure. So then we come to the constraints of the enabling environment. The fact that there isn't an enabling environment in the case of WhatsApp and GB. And of course, GB, what we have is, Jean-Luc and I just came back from this 2-day workshop with GB departments, with all the water-related departments. And it was an eye-opener, although it wasn't surprising. It was still an eye-opener to sense the differences between the departments, the fact that they don't actually talk to each other, and they're territorial. So the state is fragmented in Pakistan, we know that. And really, I'd like to look more into this in terms of how this is related, whether this has been exacerbated by the 18th Amendment, for example, and whether it's inherent in a federal model of government. So we have multiple federal ministries related to water, everything from previously the Ministry of Environment, which since the 18th Amendment is no more, all the way to the Ministry of Education. They deal with water, sanitation, hygiene in schools, Ministry of Agriculture. So you got all this range of line agencies on the federal level, but not one really in charge until MOCC, Ministry of Climate Change, took over, and they were the former Ministry of Environment. Okay, so you got all that on the federal level, and a lot of this is replicated on the provincial levels, not just in GB, but across all the other provinces. And in each province, then you have implementation, monitoring, etc., on different levels. You got the district level, you've got the tehsil level, and then you've got the union council level. And different agencies are dealing with water there. And again, there's no coordinating agency. So one of the issues in the workshop that emerged is that the GB Environmental Protection Agency was pushing very hard in the workshop that they, as a non-implementing agency, and they're just a regulatory agency, they don't actually deliver, they should be setting the standards and monitoring and regulating water. And all the other implementing agencies, such as the former Public Works Department and local government and rural development department, they need to just fall into line under the overview of EPA. Okay, so and if you look at official reports, whether it's provincial government agencies or federal government, or whether it's joint sector review with JICA and UNICEF, etc., you find that right across these reports, there's a recognition, official recognition, that there are multiple departments with varying capacities, overlapping mandates, there's gaps, there are different reporting lines, and there's limited coordination. So this is an inherent problem within the state. So when it comes to the funding model for WASAP, I mentioned that there was a lack of willingness to pay. Okay? And this shows you that there's a fundamental tension within the financing model, because there's a tension between affordability, making sure that tariffs are affordable so that people can pay and get water. And access is one of the key things that is in the water policy documents, the National Drinking Water Policy. Access is key. So in Pakistan, the government does not wish anyone to be excluded from accessing water by virtue of the fact that they can't afford it. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got this requirement, access, which means that you can't set your tariffs too high, your monthly tariffs. On the other hand, you've got this issue of cost recovery and cost sharing. Okay, they don't go together. Yeah, higher access means lower tariffs, which means you're unlikely to recover your costs, which means you're unable to undertake the necessary repairs. Okay? And in the case of WASAP, the monthly tariffs where they collect usually can cover minor repairs. They also have an endowment fund, TDR, the term deposit receipt. You all know TDR? Does anyone know TDR? So it's a fixed deposit scheme in a bank, which earns you a fairly high interest rate, and they live off that interest. They don't call it interest, of course, because they call it profit, because you can't have interest. And they live off that interest. Usually pays for the salary of a plumber, and the communities either collect regular tariffs to contribute to the cost, the material costs of parts, etc., or if they're not collecting regular tariffs, whenever there's a need, they come together and they all contribute, and the plumber fixes makes the repairs. They're able to do this, but the problem is the longer term, the bigger repairs are not sustainable, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, I talked about the short-term funding, and there is a huge problem with the short-term versus long-term financing. And the key issue is that these water schemes, this water infrastructure have a natural lifespan. The natural lifespan is 15 years rural and 20 years urban. That's the estimate which AKU uses, which basically means that after 15 years, things really start breaking down. And these are not just about normal maintenance. These are wholesale asset renewal. You need to renew the asset. Okay? Not only that, after 15 to 20 years, what you expect is population growth. So the systems need to be expanded. And these are two major expenditures that have not been factored into this model, in the financing model. And there's still no, if you talk to government departments, you talk to AKU, they agree that they just want to get the water out to people and then deal with that problem later, 15 years down the road. But in terms of sustainability, you cannot say that it's sustainable in that case. Okay, so I'm going to read a few quotes here. So this slide is really whether is community management sustainable. So this has been a few quotes from the literature. The first one says, the community management model is unable to provide sustainable water service to rural people. And these are all quotes. Rural communities lack the financial resources to support development or to maintain new systems. Communities cannot independently operate and maintain drinking water supply systems, even with relatively low complexity installations. So the idea is, you don't want to put a complex, elaborate network in a community that doesn't have the capacity to pay or to maintain that system. So you have fairly simple systems. But even then, the findings is that communities find it difficult. It is now increasingly recognized that the majority of communities will be unable to manage their own water supply systems without some form of external assistance. But even with improved approaches focusing on increasing management capacity, is that enabling environment to train communities, it is simply not realistic to expect rural communities to be completely self-sufficient, especially in the early years of a project's completion. So as a result, community management is characterized by waning community interest and a reluctance to volunteer, and unwillingness by communities to pay for maintenance, and difficulties collecting tariffs and enforcing sanctions. With the result being that users exit by refusing to contribute financially, and managers exit by ceasing to be active. And we saw a lot of this happening in AKA, not in the better managed ones, but certainly, and the better managed ones have got, they've got social capital in place. They've had a long history of working with Aga Khan agencies in building institutions like women's organizations and village organizations, and they have the management experience, but not all of them have that. Okay? So we find that a lot of these water and sanitation committees, they don't have elections for the committee, okay? Because no one really wants to run for it. So they have volunteers. Volunteers come up to offer their services. And what we found is actually these volunteers are not being replaced because no one wants to replace them, or no one wants to do this work. And so you have to be really dedicated to want to do it. So it really chimes with what's being said in the wider literature. That's why looking at the wider literature for any sort of research is really, really key to understand, to undertake when you're undertaking any research. So the next question that we have is, why the promotion of community management despite these problems? To me, that's a real interesting question. And that's a political economy question for me. The quote I have here is, there is a reluctance amongst academics and practitioners to challenge the community-based management model. Why is that? Any ideas? Yeah, no, but the model is not working. We're saying the model is not sustainable because it needs external support. And even with external support, communities struggle. And in any case, a lot of external support is not available. And the other enabling factors around policy support and institutional legislative support is not in place. And it's still being promoted. Okay? So let me read a few things. Community management is funded by a new wave of donor and NGO programs, largely bypassing government structures. Now, I should qualify here, I think it's important to qualify that the work of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and AKDN, Aga Khan Development Network in general, do not fall under this, because AKDN agencies always work with and through government. But not some very, very big agencies work around government. And can I name names?
Sure.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, that do a lot of work on sanitation, are, my words, notorious for bypassing government. They don't trust government, basically, because they think governments are incompetent, inefficient, corrupt. Right? And that may well be the case, okay? But if government has to play a key role, you can't just say, let's sideline them. You need to engage with them, which is why we were in GB, engaging with the state departments. Okay, so decentralized service delivery really bypasses the so-called centralized bureaucratic state. And this is a real strong neoliberal anti-state bias here. It is really about an ongoing distrust of governments on one hand. So neoliberalism is really about small state, small government. whether it's the Conservative Party in the UK or whether it's the Republicans in the US. They believe in small government. Okay? And on the one hand, and on the other hand, this faith, this continued faith, and this faith in communities and the private sector. My feeling is that there's been state failure, there's been private sector failure. Okay, I think one can be fixed really. The state failure can be fixed through resources. The private sector failure can be fixed through higher tariffs to make it profitable for the private sector to come and deliver water, but that's not going to happen because people cannot afford it. Okay, so you're left with the state. So the solution would really be, let's revisit the state and see how we can make the state do its job better, because the state is not doing its job well. I'm the first to say that. But instead, they're going, let's go to communities. And you have to ask the question, why? Why are they continuously bypassing the state? So essentially, it's a shift of responsibility of service provision from national governments. It allows governments to go, we're not responsible for water anymore because communities are. And in many ways, it's part of the empowerment discourse where you see this happening a lot in India as well, through these self-help groups. Governments cannot lift people out of poverty because they cannot provide jobs. Guess what? Let's empower communities, and you look after your own destiny. Yeah? You go and start up a micro business and lift yourself out of poverty. So the state steps back and doesn't have to deal with this. So community participation replaces the lost state capacity because the state's capacity has been rolled back constantly. So how is this reflected in policy? So I've got two sets of policies here, and this is my last slide. I'm sorry about that. And I asked the question, who formulates water policy? So you can't see this is too small. So this is the National Drinking Water Policy, 2009, drafted by the Ministry of Environment. It says, and I'm going to put this side by side with the GB Draft Drinking Water Policy, drafted by Government of Gilgit-Baltistan or the Gilgit-Baltistan Assembly. So the first point is, it says community management will be promoted. Participation of communities will be encouraged to promote community ownership and empowerment as well as sustainability. So this is written into national policy, this promotion of communities. So that kind of frames the whole discourse already and what can and cannot be done. In GB, it says special financial allocation will be made to mobilize communities and facilitate community development. Community management may be promoted in small and rural water supply projects. So you can see it's a mirror. And it goes on to talk about building capacities. It goes on about talking about streamlining institutions, government, state departments. And finally, I think this is the most important one for me, on a national level, private entrepreneurship and public-private partnerships for enhancing access of safe drinking water, operations and maintenance of water supply systems, resource mobilization, and capacity development will be promoted. Similarly, for GB, it says public-private partnerships for enhancing access to safely managed drinking water, rehabilitation and upgradation of existing water supply schemes, and operations and maintenance of completed water supply systems would be explored. It's verbatim, okay, so it's not, my English is that bad, but would be explored for urban areas. So you can see PPP, public-private partnerships, is a key thing. So this whole ideological marriage to community and to the private sector is reflected all the way up in government policy. And I hope I've pointed out some of the tensions and contradictions here. So thank you, that's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to leave it to Ehsan to moderate some discussion.
Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for Jeff. So just a few sort of points. I do know, because we have some of these conversations in our courses around markets and particularly urban water governance, if some of you have taken that session with us. And this question of, I know a lot of students here are also concerned about privatization of the water delivery system, and then the state failures and the state inefficiencies they've lived through, so they're very familiar with that. Uh, but I was very intrigued by Jeff raising that question, which no one really took on. But why continue to support community-based models, even when evidence suggests that they're not as amazing in their delivery, especially given certain constraints. Particularly, I really appreciated the point you made about repairs. So projects and infrastructure projects have life cycles. And we see this in, like, my own work is focused on larger infrastructure projects. And so they may have longer lifespans. But still, after 30, 40, 50 years, you need to figure out what to do with a big barrage, with a big dam you need to repair. And that's, again, like a new cycle of loan that we see there as well. But I'm really intrigued and particularly interested in people thinking about this question. That personally, I think there is a somewhat of a romantic view of the communities as well, like this idea, which is not a bad view, which is something to is grounded in some logic that people who are going to benefit the most should have control over their resources and do the management. But the collective action problem, people coming together and solving a complex problem of managing resources, tariff collection, it's a tough one. It's a challenging one. So I think we need to kind of while we're thinking about whether the state should do it or the private sector should do it, there is some sort of romanticization with the community. And I think what I really appreciated about Jeff's talk is to get into the nitty-gritty of that, okay, fine. It works, but where does it work? What does success mean? What kind of continuous support and that sort of assistance is required? And then community, who's taking the burden for this kind of work? And then you can, as researchers, you can ask further questions about which models work within different communities, which are better. So obviously, Aga Khan development generally is considered much better than other development models, but it seems like, as Jeff pointed out very nicely for us, that out of the 450 points of water delivery, I imagine 90% work, but they're not magical. They work because there was some investment in them. There was some repairs. So very concrete, practical. I know some of you have worked on government issues. I know ICRA has worked on this fragmentation of governance when it comes to floods. So a lot to chew on. I would open the floor now to questions or comments. While you're asking the question, please introduce yourself briefly. If you're working on something around water or governance or privatization, some interest, please have a little sort of 1-2 sentences about it. And so we're open to questions and comments. Again, let's try to keep them brief. We'll do this unfortunately for 15 minutes in this room, but then we'll move to the faculty lounge. You're all invited. You can sit there and have this cup of tea, and we can informally or even formally continue to ask questions from Jeff about this project. All right? G.
I'm still stuck at the point, the fact that the initiative or the organization has highlighted that the community may or may not have managing skills. So, which also explains the goal of the organization or, let's say, the program. So if we analyze the situation of water management in last 3 decades, I still remember there was a time when the community was solely responsible to manage water resource. We all had clean water channels. I mean, we didn't face any, maybe it's an exaggeration, but we didn't have that much water issues. So, and then there was a time where the government and some donor agencies intervened, and then we got to know that, we have water scarcity in our region. And later, we came up with the idea that some of the organization with the collaboration with the government is working to resolve all these water issues. But I mean, for me particularly, it's very hard to understand that the community which was working for last so many centuries, and all these water channels, the wells and whatever resources we have, these are mainly built by the community. And then when the organization or the program says in the end that Aga Khan Development Network, or let's say WASIP, doesn't have the funds, which the community at this point needs just fund to, whenever they face any issue. And then if the organization doesn't have funds, then what's the use of it? I mean, don't you think that this is all about ownership on water resource, be it government, these donor agencies, or the community? Because, I'm just explaining the situation which I have witnessed in last 3 decades. I don't know what the situation was before that or after, but...
Thank you. Jeff, we can take another couple of questions and you can answer. Gee, any other questions? Back there, पीछे वहाँ पे. ये mic पकड़ लें for recording purposes.
I'm Mariam from Department of Anthropology. I'm doing my MPhil there. I want to ask you about the community. Is it only the mainstream communities, or the communities you're talking about are they in their own speciality and temporality? Because there are communities in Islamabad, I know, I worked on it, that have the 4 features you've talked about, the ownership and things like that. They're managing it, they have their own boreholes, but still they do not have that access to water resources. And then we talk about you talked about localization. Then what about, how are you going to include these kind of communities that are either marginalized or vulnerable into the bigger schemes of providing water, when the sovereignty, I would say, is beholden by the capital development authorities? Thank you.
Any other questions? I'll add something similar to this idea of community. I was really curious, when you work in GB, what does the community mean? Because obviously, even the bank has this research where they talk about organic communities and organic participation and induced participation. And the word community, as used in NGOs, is used very loosely. It's also sort of reminding me of, I don't know, you're familiar with David Gilmartin's work, Blood and Water. It's about environmental history of Indus water, where he makes this claim that the modern irrigation system, even at the level of farms and villages, was seeking to create new communities of rational irrigators, so the utilitarian principle, but were with the British coming with that idea, but they were faced with communities of kinship, blood, and other sort of thing. So how does that sort of 2 different notions of community map onto it, particularly because neoliberalism wants to create a community of national level, I guess, rational utilitarian thinking irrigators or water consumers at the domestic level.
Thank you. I'll work backwards.
Sure.
I was really thinking about what you raised when that question was asked about communities. I think just to clarify, for neoliberalism, which is really the policy or political manifestation of neoclassical economics, there's no such thing as community, because the unit of analysis is individual. So ethnicity, culture, communities all don't come in the picture. And we're all rational, utility maximizing individuals who think logically. So this is a really good point about how to define a community. I think the short answer is that it's defined geographically, spatially, in a location. But it does raise a lot of interesting questions about, as San talked earlier about communities being romanticized. And this is the case here as well, that the communities are seen to be homogeneous. They all act as one unit, they all have everything in common. But in fact, in reality, one of the key issues we actually did was we realized that across GB is pretty sectarian in terms of its makeup of communities, and we had to take that into account. Okay, so we basically, so locations had range. That some were mixed, some were homogeneous. We define homogeneous as a community that was 90% or more of one particular sect. So homogeneous would be homogeneous Shia communities, homogeneous Ismaili, homogeneous Sunni communities, and homogeneous Nobakshi communities. Those are the four main ones. And we're very interested to see whether the working assumption was that more homogeneous communities would be more united, more sense of ownership, and less conflict. And in general, that was the case. Yeah? Because by extension, our working hypothesis is that once you move to urban areas, by definition, urban centers are far less homogeneous, they're far more diverse, they are far more transient, people are much more recent in terms of how long they've been there, and we would expect far less sense of unity and sense of ownership and lower levels of participation, and that's what we found as well. So but anyway, so that answers. I hope that answers the question of community, because we did really look into the issue of community. Does that answer your question?
I was asking about the marginalized communities.
Oh yes, the marginalized communities. So yes, in terms of the work of AKA and WhatsApp, it's not meant to exclude anyone. So that project will not. So if we define a community in terms of its location, yeah, so a village, no one should be excluded. And AKA will not go ahead with a project until there's unanimous or minimum 80% agreement by the community. And there's also provisions made within the communities if certain people can't pay. So in some of the very rural communities, they don't pay in rupees, they pay in kind. They pay in wheat, maybe once a year after harvest, and they'll pay an equivalent. It's all worked out. So in principle, no. So those who can't afford, the communities are meant to accommodate them and not compel them to pay. As far as I know, there's been no sanctions in terms of disconnection of water, which would be the main thing about denying access. The first question on, is it about ownership of funding? What's that? Here you are. I don't know whether things were really that good previously, and I think there's always a risk of romanticizing the past. I also like to think that the world was a better place in my childhood, for example. But I think the reality is that with population growth, that these are real issues, and I think in GB certainly, as I mentioned, water sources have become more and more polluted, water systems. But I don't think it's necessarily an issue of ownership. I think it's really fundamentally to me it's about funding. If there's sufficient funding, then we can deal with issues of how efficient you are using the funding. I just don't think there's enough funding to go into these there's so many competing groups, whether it's to build a hospital, to build a new water project, or to build schools. So competition for, what's it called, the annual development program money? Yeah. And that ADP itself is not a huge pot that goes to GB. Interestingly enough, and this is the sort of research I think needs to be looked into. I've been told that the salary component for the government in GB is huge compared to the annual development program budget. And that in itself tells us about priorities and some of the politics or the political economy there. Sorry.
Yeah. We can have another round of questions. I see a couple of hands, but just to sort of follow up on a couple of things you mentioned. So obviously, to me, the repair piece seems very significant, but when we think about governance, that also applies to, let's say, roads. The roads go bad after a certain amount of time. They need either repair or rehaul. And so that applies to a lot of different infrastructure. But water, obviously, is something slightly different in the sense of it's the everyday need. Everyone wants quality, clean water. So when we speak about, as you were mentioning, the willingness to pay is not there. That sort of economic measure which is kind of like the tough question about how to value or price something which is not like market-based transaction. So, do you see, compared to maybe other governance, I don't know if you've looked at it from this angle, that still there's more willingness to pay or willingness to volunteer with time in these water kind of projects, or is it pretty much the same as other projects as well? Because the repair part, as I mentioned, it's applicable obviously to a lot of different infrastructure projects. I saw one hand there. Yeah.
Yes. It's Abdul Qadir here. I'm a student of anthropology. And I'm thankful, Professor Jeff, for your talk, and of course, Dr. Hassan's team for organizing this. But what I was, curious to think about, first of all, I agree with what Hassan mentioned in the beginning, that we have serious sort of concerns about some fundamental notions of your presentation, like ownership of water, what constitutes community. For example, thinking with Mariam, if we consider Gilgit-Baltistan's status in Pakistan, I think we need to, first of all, settle with this, that how it is important and how we need to, untangle this what you said, that there is this simultaneous failure of state on the one hand and then the private sector on the other hand. Then we have to also think with this some fundamental notions about like what constitutes water. Maybe do we think that water is some kind of bounded entity, or is it flowing? If it is flowing, then who owns that? The flow of the water, and who is ultimately going to be the community, where we expect that community should be informed and its participation should come there, and it untangles this fundamental notion of like what remains failure of state, and then ultimately who is going to be the the makers of private failures. If we can untangle this relationship, which I think is quite difficult to untangle here, like we can think with in case of property development in Pakistan. So what constitutes private and where state recedes from its role, I don't see any such sort of distinction in particular place of state. But now I come to this fundamental question of mine, which I think comes from this very doubtful understanding about this epistemic role, like role of experts. If we consider anthropological evidence, for that matter, we can think with Timothy Mitchell and many important studies about Cape Town's collapse in terms of water engineering and the role of expert communities. And then ultimately we saw that despite so much governance efforts, so much input from the policy experts, we saw that ultimately it leads either to unwanted directions, or we don't see any kind of tangible practical outcomes where ultimately community is felt one very important role player or one very important actor in that. So yes, thank you.
So we'll take Abdul's question quickly, and Jeff, you can, if you can just give a brief response.
Yeah, sure.
We're gonna need to leave this
sure.
in
I
5-10 minutes.
Yeah.
But we will continue the conversation
sure.
of that. Either take.
I will just have a comment that because how we are making.
Sulaiman, what's your background?
I'm Abdur Rahman. I'm a PhD student here. Okay. Yeah, and I'm working on the groundwater in Rawalpindi and Islamabad. Right. So my comment on this question of community is that it's the most linguistically diverse region. So there is a discursive dimension to this whole material manifestations which we talked in terms of infrastructure and everything. So how people have been making sense through their linguistic orientations and how these things have changed because their languages are also dislocated in this whole context. But I see that because people have been thinking about these springs or water resources in very different way, that maybe who like prior water rights, like who is the first person to use and divert for the beneficial purposes of that, which was very much rooted in the community, I'll say. Linguistically, there are a lot of evidences and there are diverts. So, and these, like I will say, this prior water right, that first in right and first in use thing, that how it becomes operational in the time of climate change, urbanization, and then agriculture as well, because there are a lot of water-intensive crops in the GB, and how it's perceived today. It's in the popular image that apple and cherries and everything. So I think I will just stop myself here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just very quickly, I'm not sure I fully got the point about the linguistic connection and beliefs, but in terms of your comment on the water rights, that ties in with the previous question on what constitutes water when it's bounded or when it's flowing. Because one of the key things that we found, of course, is one big challenges a lot of communities face in GB is that they can't access water because they don't have rights to that source. And this is ongoing, and this is unresolved. And this has taken generations and it continues to be unresolved, and I don't know what the solution would that be. Every government talks about needing to change this traditional water rights, but it's still there. And of course it's new to me, but I've been made very aware of it. So perhaps let's talk about the linguistic thing a bit later so you can clarify for me. Just the first question was on yours. Willingness to pay, the evidence for that. I think willingness to pay is always an issue, regardless of country or income levels when it comes to water at least. I mentioned already in the UK, water tariffs are regulated. Yeah, so the private provider just can't increase the rates. But more importantly, to give you an idea, one of the things that has been talked about in GB and by AKU is the introduction of water meters. Because if we're talking about water conservation and environmental sustainability, we need to regulate behavior. The problem is that if everyone's paying a flat, very low tariff, AKU is facing huge problems. One of the problems with the shortage of water is because people use it for watering their gardens, vegetables and stuff, and it's meant for drinking. You're meant to use stream or channel water or government water for that. So that's one of the key issues. The suggestion was we need water meters, but there's huge resistance to the introduction of water meters, and that should come as no surprise because, believe it or not, in England, there are a lot of places without water meters still. Yeah, there you go. Households refuse to install water meters, especially if they've got gardens. They refuse to install water meters, they prefer to pay a flat fee. And this is in a high-income, advanced country, and they can't sort of do these sorts of things. You can imagine how much more difficult it is in poorer countries. But we can continue this discussion because I'm out of time.
Sure. So we're gonna move to the faculty lounge, and you guys can have some chai. But I want to thank Professor Jeff Tan for giving us this really nuanced and deep kind of, as I mentioned earlier as well, a lot of times we think at that very broad level, abstract level of neoliberalism and capitalism and governance failures. But really, it's really good to get into this nitty-gritty and to think about problems of state delivery, problems of people, and also the exhaustion of this idea of volunteer-based management, co-management, and the problems with metering, because all of this obviously in the context of GB that's the context today, but the legislation and the broader push in all of Pakistan is going towards some kind of decentralized, metered water, pseudo-market-based delivery systems that are emerging. So GB has a lot of history of these kind of projects, and again a lot of financial external support as well. So it's really important to learn these lessons from there and to think about it in the broader context of Pakistan. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Jeff Tan. Let's continue this in the next room. Thank you.
Thank you.